Hello everyone, thank you so much for joining me. I have a little bit of a different video for you today, but I'm super excited because I've been working on a quilt pattern that I wanted to give to all my friends out here in YouTube land. A special thank you for joining me on my quilting journey, making my videos and doing tutorials and just spending time with me throughout my week. I had in mind a different project to give away at Christmas, and then I was at church a couple weeks ago and they played a song that just really touched me, and it inspired this quilt pattern, and I would like to give it to you. So in the description box below, you'll see the title of the video. If you're on a mobile device, there will be a little gray arrow. Click on that. If you're on a PC or some other kind of device, you might see a caption that says see more. Click on that and it's going to open the description box. In the description box is a clickable link that brings you over to my Dropbox where you'll find this pattern. It is a 9-page PDF. It has a cover sheet and 2 pages of instructions and then templates to make this quilt. And so there's 9 pages. I'm going to go ahead and hold this quilt up. You're not going to be able to see it. Oh, you can't see it. Okay, I'm going to put a picture right here of a full view of this quilt. Now, many of you are experienced quilters and you'll be able to just follow along with the written instructions in the PDF and make this quilt. However, I have a lot of new quilters that have joined my channel, and I would like to walk you through step by step in making this quilt. Let's see how big this quilt is. It is 32 inches wide and 40 inches long. I think it's going to be perfect to fit right behind me. I cannot wait. So let's see. I lost my train of thought. I'm going to go ahead and walk you through each one of the steps, and of course you can pause it and sew along with me, and you can fast forward to different parts that you might have questions about, or you can watch the whole thing and just spend about an hour hanging out and sewing with me, and maybe take a break from your busy, chaotic Christmas time and get a cup of tea, a cup of coffee, and just sit down and hang out with me. I think that would be a lot of fun. I'm going to walk you through again step by step of the quilt process, and at the end I'm going to do a little bit something different. I'm going to bring you along for part of the quilting process with my Nolting, and I'm going to play the song that inspired this quilt. Again, I had a tree skirt pattern in mind. Maybe that'll be something that I do for next year, but this song really spoke to me, and I feel like I cannot be alone when you hear the song. I can't be the only one who's moved by the lyrics, and I really feel like we live in such a crazy, chaotic world, and it's a broken world, and we all need encouragement. Even if today is really good, we don't know what tomorrow brings, and so I just want you to have something, this quilt, to inspire you. You know, make this quilt for yourself or a family member or a friend who needs some encouragement. And I'm really hoping that every time you look at it, it just reminds you to have faith, right? Okay, I'm going to try not to get emotional. We've had a fantastic year. This is probably my last project and my last video for 2018. And just looking back, I've gotten to know so many fantastic friends, and I actually consider you extended family. And so a Merry Christmas to all my family out there. And I hope that you have a wonderful, blessed Christmas. And I cannot wait for 2019. I have a lot of videos already jotted down in a list to help me stay organized and keep me on track. So, all right, I'm not going to hold us up any further. Let's go ahead and jump into making this quilt. We're going to go step by step, and then have some music inspiration with quilting at the end. I think that'll be fun. Okay. We'll see you in a minute.
We are ready to get started. I'm going to start with page 1 of the written instructions right at the top. We are going to use our favorite fusible. Today I'm using Heat and Bond Light, and we're going to trace out all of the letter templates. Now each one of the letter templates has been mirror imaged, and so you are ready to start tracing, and you will find them on page 4 to page 9. You'll notice inside the letter is the word that the letter corresponds with, and so when you're tracing, it would be really helpful if you just write the word inside the letter, because once you cut out all of your little letters, you're going to have a really big pile of them, and having the word inside will help you just stay organized and help you map out where each one of the letters goes. I'm going to go through and trace each one, fitting them all onto this one sheet, much like a jigsaw puzzle. My tracing is not perfect, but I do cut out my lines much better than I trace them. Going through and tracing them each out. Do this for each one of your letters, and then heat up your iron. We will fuse this to the material that you want to cut your letters out of.
Okay, you can see that I got them all to fit on that one piece of Heat and Bond. Now I'm ready to bring in the fabric that I want to use for my letters, and I'm just going to follow the instructions on the Heat and Bond and fuse this to the wrong side of the fabric. This only takes a minute. First, I'm going to get rid of all the extra material. Go through and fuse down your fusible product with all your letters written on there. And then you can start cutting out each one of your letters. And you cut them out directly on the line. This is a raw edge applique pattern. If you're using freezer paper, you can, of course, give yourself room to flip over to the other side. That would be a lot of flipping, a lot of pressing. That's why I love raw edge applique, because it's so much quicker. Go through and cut out each one of your letters. And then we'll be ready to move on to preparing the center of our quilt.
Now we are ready to go ahead and begin preparing the center of our quilt. You'll see I have a big stack of letters. I'm just going to move them off to the side. For the center of our quilt, and this is where we are fusing the letters onto the background, you're going to need about 7/8 of a yard of fabric. Now I have a little bit more because when I bought all of my fabrics, they were on sale, and I bought a little bit extra. We're going to cut the center of our quilt to 22.5 inches wide and 30.5 inches long. To get it all to fit onto my mat, I'm just folding it. That's the easiest way for me to cut it out and make sure that it's all nice and square, is to fold it. Make sure if you do that, that you're folding and you're lining up all of the folds on the straight lines on your mat. So now I have the length at 30.5 inches. And now we're going to refold it, and we're going to cut out the width of our center. This is folded in half, and so I'm going to count over 11 1/4 inches and cut it out, or cut straight along the line. And that will give me 22 1/2 inches wide. So there is the center of our quilt, or our background. Now we're ready to play with the placement of all of our letters. And you'll see how if you write each word within the letter, it helps you sort of lay out all of your letters. Once you have them all laid out in the desired location, you can go ahead and fuse them into place using the instructions with the type of fusible that you're using. Once you have fused all of your letters onto your background, you're ready to go ahead and stitch them down. Today I'm going to use a satin stitch on my machine, and I tested out my satin stitch on a scrap piece of background fabric using the same fabric that I'm going to use for my letters. And I want to make sure that all the settings are right before I start stitching on my quilt. I thought I'd bring you along for part of this process. In case you're super new. I do have some videos on my channel that go more into detail about doing, sorry about my finger, doing a satin stitch, and some tips about where to stop in your background or on the letter. Tips to help you get a nicer, cleaner finish satin stitch. I realize here in just a second I'm putting my hand in your way. So go through and use your favorite applique stitch. You could use a blanket stitch, you could use a zigzag stitch, a satin stitch, you could even use a straight stitch. Whichever stitch that you want to do, go ahead and go around each one of your letters, permanently stitching it down. Today I'm using my brand new sewing machine. I got a Juki HZL F600, and so I'm really breaking in my new machine with this quilt. I did a small little project over the weekend just to see how it feels to sew with her. So this is my real first quilt on this new machine, and it's going to take some getting used to. And one of the features that I love that this machine has is a knee lift. I've always wanted a sewing machine with a knee lift, and so that was a requirement in my upgrade. And so you can see I'm not having to reach through and raise the presser foot as I go along. I'm doing that all with my knee, so I'm really excited about that. I was on the fence about an upgrade. There was absolutely nothing wrong with my Singer patchwork machine. She is still sewing like she's brand new. But I've also been wanting some upgrade features. And so recently found this machine and it was on sale. And so we just really could not pass it up. So going along, stitching down at the edge of my letters. I'm going to bring you in for a little bit of a closer view here in just a second. Here we are a little bit closer, and you can see the open toe foot for doing applique. That foot is going to take some getting used to. Now, I did want to not forget to mention that I do have a lightweight tearaway stabilizer on the back side of my work, and that will help you prevent a lot of puckering that you might get if you don't use some kind of stabilizer underneath of your quilt top. So go ahead and use some phone book paper or any kind of tearaway stabilizer that you like, and place that behind your fabric before you start stitching, especially if you're doing a satin stitch. If you're doing something a little bit lighter, then it might not be necessary to have that stabilizer underneath your work. Yeah, up close you can see how I'm just following along the edge of the letter and stitching everything down. So go ahead and stitch down all your letters, and then we're going to begin working on the small border around the center of the quilt. Here we are, all of my letters have been stitched down using a satin stitch, and we're ready to begin working on the small border that outlines the center of the quilt. We're going to cut out our strips at, let's see, 1.5 inches wide, and I'm using 43-inch wide fabric, and so I'm going to cut 3 strips of 1.5 inch wide borders. If you're using a different width, you want approximately 114 inches of border fabric. And so that might require more strips than 3. Prepare and cut 114 inches long worth of border fabric. And then I like to go ahead and sew all of my strips together. So I have 3 strips I'm going to join with a 1/4 inch seam allowance and press them when I'm finished. I just joined all 3 of my strips together, and so now I have one long continuous strip of border fabric, and we're ready to start joining it to the center of our quilt. For our small border, I'm going to join it to the left and the right sides of the quilt first, and I am glue basting mine. You could use pins, or you could just hold it and matching up your raw edges and sew right along. I'm a huge fan of glue basting. It helps me stay very accurate, and so you'll see me going through and putting small dots of glue along the edge and heat setting and drying the glue with a little bit of steam, and the steam just speeds up the drying process. So we're not bringing any wet glue to the sewing machine. Everything is nice and dry, but I won't have any pins in my way. And it helps keep my border fabric exactly where I want it while I'm sewing. Once you have your side borders on, go ahead and sew these with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and then we will square up the left and right side border when we're done. I'm finished sewing a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and now we're going to give our borders a press. I'm just going to go straight down and press this nice and flat on both sides. And I like to do this before we move on to the top and bottom borders. Pressing right along. Now, once you've pressed your borders, we can go ahead and square up any extra fabric that hangs over the center of our quilt. And I just do that by matching up the raw edge of the center of the quilt to the lines on my ruler, making sure everything is nice and square. I trim up at the top and the bottom. Once you've done this, you're ready to repeat the process and add the small border to the top and the bottom of your quilt. I'll bring in my pressing surface because again, I'm going to glue baste mine into place. And I'm just putting small little dots right in that seam allowance, just enough to hold the border fabric in place, and drying it with a good hot iron and a little bit of steam. Do that for the bottom and then flip it over and add your top border as well. Once you've glue basted or pinned your top and bottom, cut off a little bit extra and sew this with a 1/4 inch seam allowance as well. I am back from the sewing machine and I've sewed the top and the bottom small borders, and I'm ready to finger press them down into place and give that a good press with the iron. Make sure everything is nice and flat. Flip it over and do the top. I like to use a little bit of steam. Make sure those seams are nice and flat. And now I'm going to go through and repress and make sure everything is nice and straight and all my seams are laying down. Once this is done, I'm going to remove my pressing board and square up the top and bottom borders. Again, I'm just using the lines on my ruler and matching them up with my borders and trimming away the extra little bits. If you do this as you go along with your quilt, you'll really help to keep everything nice and square. All right, now we're ready to start creating some circles. Now we are ready to start cutting out our 4.5 by 4.5 inch squares that make up the large border that goes around the center of our quilt. You'll need 8 different fabrics. I bought 1/4 yards because these fabrics were on sale at Joann's, and I like having a little bit of extra fabric when I'm making a project. All of the extra bits that don't get used just go into my stash, and so nothing is wasted. But you'll need at least 1/8 of a yard of each one of your 8 different colors. You can see here I'm going to go ahead and arrange my fabrics in the order that I want my quilt border to go into. I have 4 pieces of fabric on the top and 4 pieces of fabric on the bottom, and I'm going to cut out all of my 4.5 inch squares at the same time. Anything that helps me save time in my project, I'm all about that. So from each color, you're going to need 6 4.5 by 4.5 inch squares. From those 6 squares, you will have some left over, and so you'll have some 4.5 inch squares to put into your stash when we're done. It's going to give you just a couple extra. You can see here I'm just going along and cutting 4.5-inch strips into my fabric. I think I have one more left to go. There we go. And now I can flip everything around and cut them in the other direction. I realized that because I bought quarter yards, I can actually get 2 sets of squares from each one of these cuts. And so I'm going to have a lot of little bits left over from these fabrics. So there are my 6 squares from the first stack of 4 fabrics. And I'll set them aside and do the same exact thing with the other stacks of 4. Lining everything up with the lines on the mat helps keep everything nice and square. I go through and layer this stack on top of the previous cut squares. And we'll be ready to move on. This is what my border is going to look like. I think that will be really pretty. All right, let's start cutting some circles. All right, we have taken 4 of our squares from each color and set them aside. And now we're going to use the leftover squares to create our circles. There is a circle template in your pattern. If you choose the actual size in your printer settings, this should give you an exact 4-inch circle that you're going to trace 14 times. And within the circle, you're going to notice 2 lines. One is a cut line and one is a position line. Go ahead and mark those within your circle. Again, trace this out 14 times and we'll be ready to move on. After you have your 14 circles all traced out, go ahead and cut them not directly on the line. Give yourself a little bit of space around each circle, separating them, and we're going to press these to the wrong side of our leftover 4.5 by 4.5 inch squares. So just going through and cutting them apart. And getting them ready to be fused. Now we're ready to fuse our circles onto the wrong side of our 4.5 by 4.5 inch squares. Make sure to use the pressing directions for the type of fusible that you're using. Once it's nice and cooled off, you can cut your circle out directly on the line. So just going around and cutting out your circle. And then on the cut line, you're going to cut your circle in half. Once it's cut in half, we're ready to fuse it onto our border squares that we've set aside. So go ahead and do this for each one of the 14 circles, cutting out the circle and then cutting them in half. As you can see here, I've laid out and arranged all of my half circles onto my border 4.5-inch squares and arranged them in the order that I wanted everything to go. Now I'm going to bring you in a little bit closer and show you how to use the position line on your circle template to place your half circle directly in the center of your 4.5-inch square. So the first thing I do is I'm going to remove the paper backing and just set that aside for a second because we're going to use that. We're going to take our 4.5-inch square and give that a press. Pressing it right in half, that gives you a center line to use as a guide. Now take your paper with the position line and place it on the pretty side of your fabric and line up your position line with the line that we just pressed on the 4.5-inch square. That's going to give you a 1/4 inch on either side at the very bottom. 1/4 inch there and a 1/4 inch on the other side. Now there's a different way that you could also do this. Let's bring in a piece of paper. Maybe that'll help you see things a little bit easier. If you take a ruler and line up a 1/4 inch from the raw edge of your square, that will give you your 1/4 inch seam allowance on the left and right of the bottom of your half circle. And we are placing the raw edge of your half circle right along the raw edge of your square. I'm going to bring in a different square so maybe it has a little bit more contrast and help you see that a little bit easier. Again, line up 1/4 inch and then you can bring in your half circle, line it up to the bottom and give that a press. Now you're ready to sew all of your half circles with your favorite applique stitch. We are coming back to the sewing machine and I'm going to show you how I do a satin stitch around my little half circle. I am using a lightweight tearaway stabilizer on the back side to help keep my stitch nice and pretty and prevent any puckering. Now I did want to say at this point you'll notice that you did have 4.5 by 4.5 inch squares for your borders that do not have half circles for them, and that is what we want. Our 4 corners of our quilt will not have the little half circle in them. So if you've noticed that and you're wondering what went wrong, you are perfectly fine. So go ahead and stitch down each one of your, let's see, 28 half circles. This will give you some good quality time with your sewing machine, which was really good for me because I'm breaking in and trying to become accustomed to this new machine. Going through, you'll notice that I do stop a lot and turn my work to get a nice, pretty, even satin stitch all the way around. Once you're done, you can easily remove the tearaway stabilizer on the back and continue on with your next half circle. Once you've stitched the 28 half circles, you're ready to go ahead and arrange your borders in the order that you want to stitch them together. So that's what I'm doing here, just going through and arranging each one of my pieces in the order that I want to stitch them. Now, of course, you could glue baste your borders together, you could pin them together, or just chain piece them together. But once you have them at your sewing machine, you want to stitch each one of your seams with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. 2 of your stacks, the very first and last square will not have your half circles. I have all of my 4 borders sewn together and pressed nice and flat, and we're ready to assemble them to the center of our quilt. Again, I'm going to glue baste mine and help keep myself nice and straight. I'm going to start with the left and the right borders, and these are the 2 borders that have half circles on each one of your 8 pieces. Lining everything up, matching up the raw edges, and drying the glue as I go along. I love that method. There's no pins that will prick my little fingers at the sewing machine. And for me, it helps keep everything nice and straight. Now you can see everything lined up perfectly. All of my edges at the top and bottom lined up just right. There will be no trimming that needs to be done after you sew on your borders. Now I'm glue basting the left side of my quilt, and once this is nice and dry, I'm going to sew both of these seams with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. We'll come back and press them open. I just finished pressing open and nice and flat the seams for my left and right borders, and everything is all nice and lined up, and we're ready to repeat the process with the top and bottom borders. Now these are the 2 borders that do not have the half circles on the very first square and the very last square. Again, just glue basting all of my border right to the raw edge, lining everything up. We'll do this for the top, and then flip the quilt over and repeat the process for the bottom border as well. Flipping over and doing the bottom. So your 4 corners of your quilt will not have any half circles in it. Going through and glue basting. Once the glue is nice and set and dry, you can bring this to the sewing machine and sew this with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and then press your borders open. I just finished pressing the top and bottom borders, and everything is nice and flat, and that completes the construction of our quilt top. So yay! Now it doesn't all fit into the frame, and so I'm going to show you a picture of the quilt pinned onto my design wall right here, so you get a full view of what the quilt looks like. At this point, you're ready to layer your quilt with your batting and your backing, and finish your quilt with any type of quilting that you would like to do. All of the measurements for the batting and the backing and your binding are in the PDF on the very first page, the cover page. Now the rest of the video is going to be me quilting this quilt, and I would just like to bring you along and maybe give you a little bit of inspiration. Keep in mind, I'm still trying to find a really good position for my camera while I'm doing quilting, so there might be a little bit of shaking with the camera, but I'm hoping that it doesn't make you too seasick while I'm doing the quilting. I really just want to share this song with you, and I hope that again, your Christmas is very blessed and that you enjoy this quilt pattern.
the strength of your children. So let faith rise up, oh heart, believe. Let faith rise up in me. It's our bread and night. Let faith rise up, oh heart, believe. Let faith faith rise up, oh heart, believe. Let faith rise up in me. One more time again. Let faith rise up, oh heart, believe it. Let faith rise up in me. Oh, let faith rise up, oh heart, believe it. Let faith rise up in me. Oh, please be still. Say the word, and I will set my feet upon the sea till I'm dancing in the deep. Lord, peace be still. You are here, so it is well. Even when my eyes can't see, I will trust the voice that speaks. You bring peace, Jesus. Let it wash me. Let it wash me. Oh, let your presence come, Jesus. Oh, I don't wanna be afraid every time I face the weight